The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a soft glow over the bedroom. I lay there, listening to the faint hum of the world outside, dreading the sound of my husband's alarm. The peace would be shattered soon, replaced by the usual morning rush. Get up, get ready, and get out the door that was our daily rhythm now, with barely enough time for even a good morning kiss. When the alarm finally buzzed, I watched Michael stir beside me, his eyes half closed as he reached for his phone, silencing it in a single practiced movement. He blinked up at the ceiling, the familiar lines of fatigue etched on his face. Lately, it seemed like every day drained a little more life from him, his time and energy siphoned away by a job that demanded everything. Once upon a time, that job had excited him, driven him even. But now it was a weight, a relentless force that kept him away more than it kept him close. "Morning," I whispered, trying to catch his eye. He mumbled a quick response, already rolling out of bed to head for the bathroom. In the mirror, I could see his reflection, disheveled, still half asleep, and already halfway mentally checked out, probably running through his tasks for the day. I propped myself up on one elbow, watching him go through the motions, brushing his teeth and splashing water on his face, a mechanical ritual performed in silence. He looked at me through the mirror, barely smiling. "I'll be home late tonight," he said, his voice low and detached. I sighed, trying to mask the disappointment creeping in. "Another late one?" "Yeah, I've got that presentation tomorrow," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. "I'll probably be gone before you're even up." I tried not to let the ache in my chest show, swallowing the words I wanted to say. This was a pattern now, and he never seemed to notice how I felt about it, never seemed to see that something was slipping between us. As he turned back to his reflection, I slid out of bed and began to prepare breakfast, listening to the shower start up. The warmth of the kitchen was comforting, a small solace in an otherwise lonely morning. I busied myself scrambling eggs and pouring coffee, anything to distract from the silence in the room. When Michael finally joined me, he was already halfway out the door, his suit jacket slung over one shoulder, his briefcase in the other hand. "Have a good day," I called out, forcing a smile. He nodded, barely looking up from his phone. "You too." The door closed behind him, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the untouched plate of food I'd prepared. I sat down, staring at the empty chair across from me. It was hard to pinpoint exactly when things had started to change between us, but I knew it was recent. The once vibrant energy between us felt distant, replaced by cold routine. I felt invisible, a mere accessory in his life now. But that same morning, as I was cleaning up the breakfast dishes, I heard the front door open. My heart skipped a beat, wondering if Michael had forgotten something. But when I turned around, it wasn't my husband who stepped in. It was Ethan. Michael's younger brother had recently moved back to town and was staying with us temporarily while he looked for a place of his own. A few years younger than Michael, Ethan had a way of carrying himself with a casual confidence that contrasted with his brother's more reserved nature. There was something about him, an easy charm and a quick smile that had always set him apart. He was Michael's opposite in many ways, and lately, his presence had become a curious distraction in my otherwise lonely days. "Morning," he greeted, grinning as he strolled into the kitchen. "Hope I didn't scare you." I returned his smile, a bit caught off guard. "Not at all. You're up early." He shrugged, grabbing a mug and pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Couldn't sleep. Thought I'd go for a run, but I realized I haven't really explored the area yet. I figured I'd come down here and check out the neighborhood." Ethan leaned against the counter, his eyes flicking over me in a way that felt both casual and attentive. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me that way. There was a warmth in his gaze, a genuine interest that felt like sunlight after a long winter. "So, how's everything?" he asked, taking a sip of his coffee. "Oh, you know, the usual," I replied, trying to sound lighthearted. "Michael's off to work already. Big presentation tomorrow." He raised an eyebrow, his expression softening. "Yeah, sounds like him. All work, no play." There was a hint of something in his tone, an understanding I hadn't expected. He seemed to catch the strain in my voice, the way I glanced away as I spoke, and I felt an odd sense of relief. Michael never asked how I felt about his long hours or the toll it took on me. He assumed I'd understand that I'd quietly wait for him to come home, even if that meant waiting forever. But here Ethan was, noticing what Michael didn't, and it felt both comforting and unsettling. "Do you miss him?" Ethan asked suddenly, his gaze piercing yet gentle. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I hesitated. I don't know, I admitted, surprised by my own vulnerability. It's just been hard lately. Sometimes it feels like I'm the only one who's holding on. Ethan nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. He didn't push, didn't pry, just listened, as if he could feel the weight I was carrying. It was something so simple, and yet it meant everything in that moment. "Well," he said after a beat, his voice warm and reassuring, "if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around. Just let me know." I smiled, feeling a flutter of something deep within. It was a small moment, a quiet connection, but it lingered long after he'd left. That simple offer to just listen felt like an anchor in a sea of loneliness, and as I watched him walk out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as invisible as I'd started to believe. I spent the day cleaning up around the house, but Ethan's words lingered with me. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around." It was such a simple statement, yet the weight of it settled deeply. I hadn't realized how much I longed for someone to notice, to really see me. The hours crept by, each one ticking slower than the last, until the afternoon sun slanted across the room. I tried distracting myself, organizing cupboards, rearranging the linen closet, flipping through a book one been meaning to start, but nothing seemed to hold my attention. Every now and then my thoughts would drift back to Ethan. The easy way he listened, his genuine curiosity that made me feel less isolated. Finally, just as the shadows lengthened, I heard the front door open again. I looked up from the book one was pretending to read, heart skipping a beat, hoping it was Michael. But it was Ethan once more, returning from his errands. He was dressed casually, his dark hair slightly tousled, and when he saw me, he gave a little wave. "Hey, still here?" he asked, grinning as he set his keys down on the entryway table. "Yep, I'm the house guardian," I joked, trying to hide how happy I was to see him. "How was your day?" "Not bad. Went to see a couple of apartments, but nothing really caught my eye," he replied, shrugging. "It's just not the same, you know." I nodded, understanding. Ethan had been moving around a lot since college, never quite settling. Now, being back in the same city as his family, he seemed more restless than ever, as if he were both searching for a place to call his own and dreading the stability it would bring. I wondered if he was as unsure about his own path as I was about mine. "You hungry?" I asked, suddenly realizing that I'd made more than enough pasta for dinner. "I was going to make some pasta if you want to join." "Are you kidding?" He grinned, his face lighting up. "Free food, count me in." He moved into the kitchen, grabbing plates and setting them on the counter with a casual familiarity. There was something about it, about sharing this quiet, domestic moment with someone, that made the house feel warmer, fuller. It was as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen, savoring the sounds of laughter and conversation that had been absent for so long. I drained the pasta, feeling the comforting heat of the steam against my face, and started mixing in the sauce. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching with that same attentive gaze. "You're a pretty good cook," he commented, inhaling the aroma. "Michael always said so." I laughed softly, trying not to let his words affect me. Well, he doesn't get to enjoy it much these days. Ethan's expression softened, and he shook his head slightly. "That guy works himself to the bone. I don't know how you put up with it." For a moment I wasn't sure how to respond. There it was again, that flash of understanding, the way he seemed to pick up on things Michael never did. It was like he could see right through me, past the smiles and half-hearted reassurances I'd grown used to giving. "It's hard sometimes," I admitted, stirring the sauce a little too vigorously. "I know he means well, and he's doing it for us, for our future. But I can't help feeling like I'm fading into the background." Ethan was silent for a moment, as if weighing his response carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. "It must be lonely." I swallowed, feeling my cheeks flush. I hadn't expected him to be so direct, to put into words what I hadn't even admitted to myself. But there it was, out in the open, and I couldn't deny it. "Yes," I murmured, surprised by the truth in my own voice. "It is." We ate together, the conversation flowing easily as he told me stories from his travels and his life over the past few years. I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, in a way I hadn't in a long time. His stories were ridiculous, his expressions animated, and I realized how much I missed connecting with someone, feeling lighthearted, unburdened. After dinner, he helped me clean up, washing the dishes while I dried them. It felt like such a simple, ordinary moment, yet it was laced with an intimacy I couldn't ignore. The way his hand brushed mine as he passed me a plate, the warmth in his gaze as we exchanged glances, each small touch and look weaving a web of unspoken connection between us. Just as I was about to put away the last dish, he cleared his throat, his voice hesitant. "Listen, I don't mean to pry, but if you ever need to talk, really talk, I'm here." There it was again, that lifeline he kept offering, as if he could sense the loneliness clawing at my edges. I wanted to reach out, to take his hand, to say something that would bridge the gap between us, but the words caught in my throat. I could feel my heart racing, my thoughts tangled and confused, and I realized I was on dangerous ground. "Thank you, Ethan," I whispered, not trusting myself to say more. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me a moment longer than necessary. And then he stepped back, giving me the space I needed to breathe, to find my footing again. As he turned to leave, I watched him go, a quiet ache blooming in my chest. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the evening over and over in my mind. The laughter, the conversation, the warmth in his eyes, all of it spun through my thoughts like a melody I couldn't shake. And though I tried to convince myself it was innocent, that I was simply grateful for the companionship, I couldn't deny the thrill that pulsed beneath my skin. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive. The next few days passed in a strange, quiet tension. Michael was his usual self, detached, busy, absorbed in his own world. I found myself watching him with new eyes, noticing all the ways he barely seemed to see me, as though I were a piece of furniture in his periphery. I tried to ignore it, to remind myself that he loved me, that his distance was just a symptom of stress. But now, after that evening with Ethan, it felt different, more acute, like an itch I couldn't scratch. Ethan and I continued our casual interactions, each one feeling more charged than the last. Sometimes he'd catch my eye across the room, holding my gaze for just a moment too long. Other times he'd brush past me in the hallway, his touch lingering, sending a shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. It was all unspoken, subtle, yet undeniable, a thread of something that neither of us seemed willing to cut. One evening, as I was loading the dishwasher, I felt him enter the room, his presence a warmth at my back. I didn't turn around, trying to steady my breathing as I continued stacking the dishes, but I could feel him, close enough that I could sense his gaze on me, watching, waiting. "You know," he said softly, his voice low and intimate, "I don't remember you being this quiet in college." The comment caught me off guard, a reminder of a different time, a different version of myself, one that felt so distant now. I glanced over my shoulder, meeting his eyes. "I guess people change," I replied, shrugging, trying to keep my tone casual. He tilted his head, a smile playing on his lips. "Maybe. But I think it's still there, that fire. Just hidden." His words lingered, sparking a memory of the woman I used to be, the one who laughed freely, who chased her dreams, who didn't feel trapped in the role of someone's wife. That version of me had faded, dulled over the years, but hearing him speak of it, as if he could still see her, made something stir inside me. For a long, silent moment, we just looked at each other. It was as though he were seeing straight through the walls I'd built, into the parts of myself I'd buried. I wanted to look away, to break the intensity of his gaze, but I couldn't. There was something magnetic about him, a pull that left me rooted to the spot. "Ethan," I started, not even sure what I meant to say. "Yes?" His voice was gentle, coaxing, like he knew there was more I wanted to say, but he wasn't going to push. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, feeling my cheeks flush. The air between us felt thick, heavy with unspoken words, and I could feel my pulse quicken as he took a half step closer. His hand reached out, his fingers grazing my arm in a feather-light touch, sending a thrill through me that left me breathless. But just as quickly he stepped back, his expression shifting, as if realizing he'd crossed a line. "Sorry," he murmured. As we lay there, wrapped in each other, he reached for my hand, threading his fingers through mine. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, a softness that I hadn't seen before, and it made my heart ache. "I don't want this to end," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I looked away, guilt settling over me like a shadow. "Neither do I, but we both know." He nodded, his grip on my hand tightening. "I know, but sometimes I wish we could just escape, leave all of this behind." The thought was tempting, a fantasy that danced at the edges of my mind. I could imagine it a life where there were no secrets, no lies, just us. But I knew it was impossible, that real life wasn't that simple. We both had responsibilities, commitments, people who relied on us. "We can't run away from this, Ethan," I whispered, my heart breaking even as I said the words. He sighed, resting his forehead against mine. "I know, but sometimes I wish we could." We sat there in silence, the weight of our choices pressing down on us. It was a quiet reminder of the price we were paying for this connection, the inevitable pain that would come when the truth finally caught up with us. And yet, even as the guilt gnawed at me, I couldn't bring myself to let him go. The night passed too quickly, and eventually he had to leave, slipping out into the night like a shadow. I watched him go, my heart aching with a mixture of longing and regret. As I closed the door behind him, I knew that our time was running out, that we were living on borrowed moments, but I was too far in to stop now. I was in love with him, as impossible as it was, and I couldn't turn back. The next day, the weight of my secret hung over me, clouding my thoughts as I went about my day. Each interaction with Michael felt like a lie, every word and gesture a reminder of the betrayal I was hiding. I could feel the guilt eating away at me, but I didn't know how to escape it. I was trapped, caught between the life I'd built and the love I couldn't let go. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, Michael walked into the kitchen, his expression more serious than usual. I glanced up, sensing that something was wrong. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He nodded, but his eyes were distant, thoughtful. "Yeah, just long day at work." I watched him carefully, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed distracted. It wasn't unusual for him to be stressed, but tonight felt different, heavier somehow. "Is there something on your mind?" I ventured, hoping he might open up. He hesitated, glancing down at the floor before looking back at me. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something. About us." My heart skipped a beat, panic creeping in as I wondered if he somehow knew, if he'd found out about Ethan and me. I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my expression neutral. "What is it?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear churning in my stomach. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know I haven't been around much lately. Work has been consuming, and I know it's taken a toll on us." I nodded, relieved that he didn't seem to suspect anything. "It has," I admitted, feeling a pang of guilt as I thought of Ethan. He took a deep breath, his gaze softening. "I want to change that. I miss us the way things used to be. I've been thinking maybe I should take some time off, focus on us for a while. What do you think?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. I'd wanted this, longed for him to notice, to make an effort. But now, with Ethan in my life, the thought of Michael being around more, of him being closer, terrified me. That sounds like a good idea," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. He smiled, reaching out to take my hand. "I want to make things right between us. You're important to me more than anything else." As he held my hand, I felt a surge of guilt so intense it nearly took my breath away. Here he was, finally willing to put us first, and all I could think about was the man I was secretly meeting in the shadows. Michael's sudden dedication to our relationship was like a double-edged sword. Part of me felt relieved, hopeful even that he was finally seeing the cracks between us and wanted to repair them. But another part of me, a dark, hidden part one, was too ashamed to admit to anyone felt trapped. His newfound attention, the hours he started spending at home, and his constant efforts to reconnect only made it harder for me to balance the two lives I was living. For days I felt like I was treading water, barely keeping my head above the rising tide of guilt and tension. Every time Michael kissed me, held me, or whispered his love, it felt like a lie, a betrayal I couldn't take back. And each time I saw Ethan, I felt the walls closing in tighter, the thrill mixed with dread. I could see the strain in his eyes, too, the way he glanced over his shoulder whenever we stole a moment together, the way he held me like he was afraid it would be the last time. One afternoon, Michael suggested that we spend the weekend at his family's cabin by the lake. It was a secluded spot, peaceful and surrounded by trees, a place we'd gone to early in our relationship when we needed to escape the world. I could see the excitement in his face, the hope that maybe this getaway would rekindle what we'd lost. The invitation filled me with a strange mix of excitement and dread. I wanted to spend time with him, to give us a real chance, but the thought of being isolated with him, with no distractions and nowhere to hide, was terrifying. Still, I agreed, knowing I couldn't keep running forever. The evening before we were set to leave, I sat in my room, packing my bag, when my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Can we talk?" My heart raced as I read the message. I knew I should ignore it, that this was the last thing I needed right now, but my fingers moved before I could stop them. "Come over," I replied, my breath catching as I hit send. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. I opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression a mixture of concern and something darker, something I couldn't quite place. "Hey," he said softly, stepping inside. "I heard you're going away this weekend." I nodded, avoiding his gaze as I closed the door behind him. "Yeah, Michael wants us to reconnect." He took a deep breath, his hands clenched at his sides. "Are you going to tell him about us?" The question caught me off guard, and I looked up, meeting his intense gaze. "No, Ethan, I can't. It would ruin everything." He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Everything's already ruined. Don't you see that? We're living in a lie. Every time I see you with him, every time I have to pretend, it's killing me." I reached out, taking his hands in mine, feeling the tension in his grip. "I know it's hard, but I can't just walk away from my marriage. I need time to figure this out." His eyes softened, and he pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as if afraid I'd slip away. "I don't want to lose you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to let you go." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of his words, the desperation in his touch. I didn't want to lose him either, but I was trapped, caught between the life I'd built and the love that had taken me by surprise. It was a choice I wasn't ready to make, and every day I delayed, the consequences loomed larger. We stood there in silence, clinging to each other, as if our embrace could somehow freeze time, could save us from the reality we'd both been trying to avoid. But I knew it was a fragile illusion, a fleeting moment that couldn't last. Finally, he pulled back, looking down at me with a sad smile. "Have a good weekend," he said, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond, and watched as he slipped out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The silence that followed was deafening, a reminder of the impossible choice that lay before me. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet. Michael seemed lost in his thoughts, occasionally glancing over at me with a small smile, but neither of us spoke much. I could feel the tension building between us, the weight of everything left unsaid. It felt like we were both standing on the edge of something, but neither of us knew how to take the first step. When we finally arrived, the familiar sight of the lake glistening in the evening light brought back memories of happier times. The air was crisp and fresh, the scent of pine filling my lungs as we unpacked and settled in. It should have felt peaceful, but I couldn't shake the anxiety that had settled in my chest. That evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Michael reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. "I miss this," he said softly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "Just the two of us away from everything." I forced a smile, squeezing his hand. Me too. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine. I know I haven't been the best husband lately. I've let work come between us, and I'm sorry for that. But I want to make things right, to show you that you're still the most important thing in my life. His words should have comforted me, but instead they filled me with a deep, aching guilt. Here he was, offering me the chance to fix our marriage, to rebuild what we'd lost, and all I could think about was the man I'd left behind. The man who held my heart in ways Michael couldn't understand. I appreciate that, Michael, I said, my voice trembling. I really do. He smiled, leaning in to kiss me, his lips warm and familiar. But as he pulled me into his arms, I felt a pang of sadness, a hollow ache that reminded me of everything I'd given up. I closed my eyes, trying to lose myself in the moment, to pretend that I could forget the other man who haunted my thoughts. But even as I lay beside Michael that night, the memory of Ethan lingered, a ghost that refused to let me go. The next day, Michael suggested a hike through the woods. I agreed, hoping the fresh air and physical activity might clear my mind. We walked in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. I could feel Michael watching me, his gaze filled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. As we reached a clearing, he stopped, taking my hands in his. Is everything okay? He asked, his eyes filled with concern. You seemed distant. The question caught me off guard, and I felt a surge of panic. I tried to hide it, forcing a smile as I nodded. Yeah, there's a lot on my mind. He frowned, squeezing my hands gently. You know you can talk to me, right? Whatever it is, we can work through it. I nodded, but the words felt hollow. I knew I should tell him the truth, confess everything, and let him see the mess I'd made of our lives. But the thought of hurting him, of watching the trust between us shatter, was too much to bear. So I stayed silent, holding onto his hand as we walked back to the cabin, my heart heavy with the weight of the secrets I couldn't bring myself to share. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the lake in shades of orange and purple, Michael and I sat on the small deck overlooking the water. The air was filled with the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the soft chirping of crickets, the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was beautiful, peaceful, and yet I felt anything but at peace. Inside, I was a tangled mess, caught between two worlds, unable to escape the consequences of my own choices. Michael sat beside me, a glass of wine in his hand, his gaze distant as he stared out over the lake. For a long time we sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, until finally he spoke, his voice soft and hesitant. Do you ever wonder if things could have been different? He asked, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The question took me by surprise, and I felt a pang of guilt as I considered my answer. What do you mean? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I mean, if I hadn't gotten so wrapped up in work, if I'd been around more, do you think we'd be happier? Closer. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. I don't know, maybe. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. I feel like I failed you, like I let you down, and I don't know how to fix that. His words pierced me, and I could feel the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. He was trying, really trying, to make things right, to rebuild the life we'd once had. But as much as I wanted to believe it was possible, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted irreparably between us. I don't think it's your fault, Michael, I whispered, my voice barely audible. We both made choices, and we both have to live with them. He looked at me then, his gaze intense, as if he could see straight through me. Is there something you're not telling me? My heart pounded, panic rising, as I struggled to keep my expression neutral. This was my chance, my opportunity to tell him the truth, to lay everything out in the open. But the thought of hurting him, of watching the trust between us crumble, was too much to bear. No, I replied, forcing a smile. I'm just tired. He studied me for a moment, as if searching for something in my eyes, then nodded, accepting my answer. Okay, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. I nodded, feeling the weight of the unspoken words between us. He was here, offering me a lifeline, but I was too deep in my deception to reach out. The guilt twisted inside me, a constant reminder of the choices I'd made, the lines I'd crossed. And as we sat there in the fading light, I couldn't shake the feeling that my time was running out, that the truth was a shadow waiting to pounce. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. Michael and I spent our days hiking, cooking meals together, and reminiscing about the early days of our relationship. On the surface, it seemed like everything was perfect, like we were finally finding our way back to each other. But beneath the surface, I was unraveling, the strain of my secrets threatening to tear me apart. By the time we returned home, I felt exhausted, drained from the constant effort of pretending, of hiding the truth from the man I'd once promised to love unconditionally. I knew I couldn't keep this up forever, but I didn't know how to stop. Ethan was still in my thoughts, still a presence that haunted me, and I couldn't bring myself to let him go. As we pulled into the driveway, I saw Ethan's car parked nearby, and my heart skipped a beat. Michael didn't seem to notice, his attention focused on unloading our bags, but I could feel the familiar rush of excitement mixed with guilt. It was a reminder of the life I'd been living in secret, a life that I couldn't escape. Once inside, I excused myself, saying I needed to freshen up, and slipped upstairs to the bathroom. I closed the door, leaning against it as I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, torn between two worlds, but I didn't know how to make the choice that needed to be made. As I splashed water on my face, there was a quiet knock at the door. I opened it to find Ethan standing there, his expression filled with concern. "I just wanted to see if you were okay," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart pounding as I stepped back to let him in. The bathroom was small, and as he closed the door behind him, the space felt even more confined, the tension between us almost suffocating. We stood there in silence, neither of us daring to move, until finally, he reached out, his hand resting gently on my arm. "I missed you," he whispered, his gaze intense, filled with a longing that mirrored my own. I swallowed, my throat tight as I tried to keep my emotions in check. "Ethan, we can't keep doing this. It's too dangerous." He nodded, his hand slipping from my arm. "I know, but I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to pretend that I don't feel this." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the tears prick at my eyes. I didn't know how to pretend either, didn't know how to let him go, even though I knew it was the right thing to do. We were both trapped, caught in a web of our own making, and the only way out was to confront the truth. "I don't want to hurt him," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But I don't want to lose you either." He took a deep breath, his gaze filled with pain. "Then maybe it's time to make a choice." The words hung in the air, heavy and final, and I knew he was right. I couldn't keep straddling the line, couldn't keep pretending that I could have both lives. It was time to make a decision, to face the consequences of my actions. We stood there in silence, the weight of our unspoken goodbye settling over us. I knew it was the end, that we couldn't keep going down this path, but the thought of losing him was unbearable. He'd become a part of me, a part one didn't know how to let go. "Goodbye, Ethan," I whispered, my voice filled with sorrow. He nodded, his eyes filled with tears. "Goodbye." He turned and left, the door closing softly behind him, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of the bathroom. I sank to the floor, my heart shattered as the reality of what I'd lost washed over me. Downstairs, I could hear Michael calling my name, his voice filled with concern. I wiped away my tears, taking a deep breath as I stood up, preparing to face him, to face the life I'd chosen. But as I stepped out of the bathroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had slipped through my fingers, a part of myself that I'd never get back. The next few days felt like a blur, a painful haze of pretending and hiding, of forcing myself to move through the motions of everyday life while something inside me had been irrevocably shattered. The weight of my choice lingered over me, thick and suffocating, but I kept pushing it down, hiding it beneath a mask of normalcy. Michael continued his efforts to reconnect, oblivious to the storm brewing within me, and each smile, each tender touch only deepened the guilt, gnawing at my insides. I thought the hardest part was over, that saying goodbye to Ethan would somehow ease the tension in my chest. But instead, I felt hollow, like I'd left a piece of myself behind, and every quiet minute felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. It was as if Ethan's absence had carved a space inside me that I didn't know how to fill. One evening, as Michael and I sat at the dinner table, I noticed him watching me, his brow furrowed, his gaze filled with a quiet intensity. "You've been distant," he said, his voice careful, as if he were afraid to push too hard. "Is everything okay?" I swallowed, forcing a smile as I nodded. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go, shifting his attention back to his food. But I could feel his eyes on me, the unspoken questions lingering between us, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the cracks in my facade became too large to ignore. Later that night, as we lay in bed, Michael reached for my hand, his fingers lacing through mine. The touch was warm, familiar, but it didn't bring the comfort it once had. Instead, it felt like a reminder of the secrets I was hiding, the lies that had become woven into the fabric of our life. "I love you," he whispered, his voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. "I love you too," I replied, my voice barely audible. The words felt hollow, empty, and I could feel the guilt rising, threatening to spill over. I wanted to tell him the truth, to lay everything out in the open, but the fear of losing him, of shattering the life we'd built, held me back. As he drifted off to sleep, I lay there in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling, my mind racing. The silence was deafening, filled with the weight of everything I couldn't say, and I knew I was running out of time. The truth was like a ticking bomb, waiting to explode, and I was powerless to stop it. The next day, as I was going through the motions of my morning routine, I heard Michael's phone buzzing on the counter. He had stepped out to get something from the car, and the screen lit up with a message notification. I glanced at it, intending to ignore it, but my heart froze as I read the words. "Hey, this is Ethan. I wanted to check in and see if she's doing okay. I know it's been rough for both of us." My stomach dropped, a cold dread settling over me as I processed the message. Somehow, Ethan had slipped, reaching out to Michael in an attempt to check on me, unaware that his message would reveal everything I'd been trying so desperately to hide. I felt the blood drain from my face, panic clawing at my insides as I struggled to think of a way to fix this, to erase the message before Michael saw it. But before I could move, Michael walked back in, his gaze landing on his phone. He picked it up, reading the message, and I could see the confusion in his expression, the way his brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of it. "Why is Ethan asking about you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. I opened my mouth, grasping for an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was blank, the carefully constructed lies I'd been hiding behind crumbling beneath the weight of the truth. I could see the realization dawning in his eyes, the way his expression shifted from confusion to hurt, and finally to betrayal. Are you involved with him?" His voice was barely a whisper, filled with disbelief and pain. I felt the tears prick at my eyes, guilt and shame crashing over me in waves. "Michael, The words caught in my throat, and I could see the devastation in his gaze, the trust we'd built over years of marriage shattering in an instant. He looked at me as if he didn't even recognize me, as if the woman he thought he knew had been replaced by a stranger. "Answer me," he demanded, his voice rising. "Were you involved with him?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice breaking. "But it's over. I ended it." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he backed away. "It's over. You think that makes it okay? You think that just erases everything?" I reached out, trying to take his hand, but he pulled away, his expression filled with hurt and anger. "Michael, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was so lonely, and you were never around. And—" "Don't you dare blame this on me," he interrupted, his voice cold. "I was working to provide for us, to build a future, and you destroyed everything." The accusation cut deep, and I felt a surge of regret, a desperate need to make him understand. "I know I messed up, I know I hurt you, but please, Michael, I love you. I want to fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You already took everything I thought I knew about us. How am I supposed to believe anything you say now?" I could see the pain etched in his expression, the way he struggled to hold himself together, and I felt my heart breaking. This was the man I'd promised to love, the man I'd betrayed, and the reality of what I'd done was crushing me. "I'll leave," he said finally, his voice hollow. "I need time to think, to figure out what I'm supposed to do now." "Michael, please don't go," I pleaded, my voice desperate. "We can work through this. We can fix this." He shook his head, his gaze cold and distant. "I don't know if we can." He turned and walked out of the house, leaving me standing there in the silence, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face as I realized that I'd lost him, that the life we'd built was slipping through my fingers, and there was nothing I could do to bring it back. The house felt empty, hollow, each room a reminder of the life we'd shared, the dreams we'd built, all of it now tainted by my betrayal. I knew I was the one to blame, that I'd made choices I couldn't take back, and as the silence settled around me, I was left with the painful truth that I'd broken something I could never repair. The hours after Michael left felt like an eternity, a painful limbo of silence and regret. I wandered through the house, each room a reminder of the life we'd built together, now hanging in the balance. My mind kept replaying our confrontation, his devastated expression, the hurt in his voice as he tried to process the betrayal. I felt hollow, as though a part of me had been ripped away, leaving nothing but a deep, aching void. As night fell, I sat alone in the living room, the silence weighing down on me like a suffocating blanket. The house felt empty, stripped of warmth, and I couldn't escape the sense of loss pressing in from every corner. I knew I should try to call him, to reach out and beg for forgiveness, but I couldn't bring myself to pick up the phone. The truth was, I didn't even know what to say. I'd shattered his trust, and no words could undo the damage I'd caused. The following days drifted by in a haze. I went through the motions, forcing myself to eat, to shower, to clean up the remnants of our last shared meal. Each mundane task felt meaningless, hollow, as if I were simply going through the steps of a life that no longer belonged to me. Friends and family began to call, concerned by Michael's sudden absence. But I couldn't bring myself to answer, couldn't bear the thought of explaining why my marriage was unraveling. Then, one evening, as I was washing dishes, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart leapt, hoping against hope that it was Michael, that he'd come back to talk, to give us a chance to work through the wreckage of our relationship. But when I opened the door, it wasn't Michael. It was Ethan. Seeing him there, standing on my doorstep with a hesitant expression, stirred a mix of emotions in me: relief, anger, longing, and guilt. I hadn't seen him since the night we'd said goodbye, and his presence was a painful reminder of the choices that had led me here. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice catching. "Hey," he replied softly, his gaze searching mine. "I heard what happened, that Michael found out. I wanted to see if you were okay." The concern in his voice broke something inside me, and I felt the tears rising, the weight of everything crashing down all over again. I stepped back, letting him in, and he closed the door behind him, watching me with a mixture of empathy and sadness. "I don't know what to do," I confessed, my voice trembling. "He's gone, Ethan. He left, and I don't know if he's ever coming back." He reached out, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder, and the simple touch was enough to break the dam holding back my emotions. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in my hands as the tears finally spilled over, years of regret and guilt pouring out in waves. Ethan sat beside me, his hand resting gently on my back, offering comfort without words. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the weight of our shared mistakes filling the space between us. "You don't have to go through this alone," he murmured, his voice soft. "I'm here for you, whatever you need." I looked up at him, the sincerity in his gaze a balm to my wounded heart. But even as I took comfort in his presence, a part of me recoiled, reminded of the cost of our connection, of the hurt we'd inflicted on the man I'd once promised to love above all else. "I don't know if I deserve that," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I betrayed him, Ethan. I lied. I broke his trust. And now I'm losing everything." He took my hand, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. "I know you're hurting, and I know you feel like you've lost everything. But you're not alone. We'll get through this together, one step at a time." The kindness in his voice, the warmth of his touch, offered a brief reprieve from the guilt gnawing at me. But even as I leaned into his comfort, I knew it was a fragile solace, a temporary balm for a wound that ran too deep to heal so easily. Over the next few days, Ethan became a steady presence in my life, a lifeline I clung to as I tried to navigate the wreckage of my marriage. He visited frequently, bringing meals, helping around the house, offering comfort in moments when the loneliness threatened to swallow me whole. In those quiet hours together, I found a semblance of peace, a reminder that, despite the pain, I wasn't entirely alone. But as comforting as his presence was, it was also a constant reminder of the choices I'd made, the line I'd crossed, and the cost of my actions. Every time I looked at him, I felt the weight of my betrayal pressing down, a reminder that I couldn't escape the consequences of the life I'd chosen. Then, one evening, as we sat in the living room, Ethan reached for my hand, his gaze filled with a mixture of concern and longing. "Have you heard from Michael at all?" he asked softly. I shook my head, my heart sinking. "No, it's been weeks, and I haven't heard a word. I don't even know where he is." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the unspoken understanding that Michael's absence was a choice, a statement that echoed louder than words. I knew he needed space, time to process, to heal, but the uncertainty was eating away at me, the fear that he'd decided to leave for good, that he'd chosen a life without me. Ethan squeezed my hand, his expression pained. "I'm sorry. I know this is hard." "I don't know how to fix this," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I don't even know if there is a way to fix it." He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I struggled to keep my emotions in check. But even as I leaned into his embrace, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still caught in a web of my own making, trapped between the life I'd lost and the man who had become my solace in the storm. That night, as I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in weeks: hope. It was faint, barely there, but it was enough to remind me that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward, a path out of the darkness that had consumed my life. But as the days stretched on and Michael remained silent, the hope began to wane, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. I knew that he was out there, somewhere, processing everything that had happened, but the longer he stayed away, the more I feared that he'd made up his mind, that he'd chosen a life without me. In the quiet moments, I found myself reaching for my phone, scrolling through old messages, photos, memories of a time when life had been simple, when love had been enough. But each reminder felt like a dagger to the heart, a painful echo of a life that was slipping further out of reach with each passing day. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, my phone buzzed with a message. My heart raced as I glanced at the screen, the familiar name lighting up the display. It was from Michael. My hands trembled as I opened the message, heart racing with a mix of fear and anticipation. I'd been waiting so long to hear from him, clinging to the hope that he'd reach out. But now that the moment was here, I felt a surge of panic. Part of me was terrified to read his words, to face the reality of what he might say, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know, needed to hear from him, no matter the outcome. The message was short, direct, and the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "We need to talk. Tomorrow at noon, I'll come by the house." It was straightforward, no warmth, no hint of forgiveness or reconciliation, just a request to meet, to finally confront the mess we'd both been avoiding. I took a deep breath, reading the message over and over, each repetition making the reality sink in further. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading, The conversation I knew would force us to face the consequences of everything I'd done. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, each one more painful than the last. I imagined him standing in front of me, his expression cold, his words laced with anger and betrayal. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the devastation I'd caused, and each imagined moment made the dread settle heavier in my chest. The next morning, I woke up early, the weight of the upcoming conversation pressing down on me like a lead blanket. I went through the motions of getting ready, barely aware of my surroundings, my mind focused entirely on what was coming. By the time noon approached, I was a bundle of nerves pacing the living room as I waited for him to arrive. When I heard his car pull into the driveway, my heart skipped a beat, a painful reminder of the love we'd once shared, now tainted by the choices I'd made. I took a deep breath, steeling myself as I opened the door, bracing for the confrontation. He stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his posture tense. He looked different, older, somehow as if the weight of everything had etched lines into his face that hadn't been there before. I closed the door behind him, swallowing the lump in my throat as I tried to find the words. But he spoke first, his tone calm, measured. "So," he began, his gaze fixed on me, "it's been a few weeks. I've had a lot of time to think." I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "I know. I'm sorry, Michael." He held up a hand, silencing me. "I don't want to hear apologies right now. I've heard enough of them in my head these past weeks." I swallowed, nodding as I lowered my gaze, feeling the shame wash over me all over again. He took a deep breath, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I loved you. I trusted you. And you destroyed that. Do you have any idea what that feels like? To have the person you love most in the world betray you?" I felt the tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to hold his gaze, to face the pain in his eyes. "I know I hurt you, Michael, and I know there's nothing I can say that will make it right. But please know that I regret everything. I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make it up to you." He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "Make it up to me? Do you think that's possible? That you can just make it up and we can go back to the way things were?" I felt a pang of despair, realizing how naive my words sounded. I knew deep down that nothing could undo the damage, that the life we'd once had was gone, shattered beyond repair. But I couldn't bring myself to give up, not yet. "I don't expect things to go back to the way they were," I replied, my voice trembling. I don't want to lose you, Michael. I love you. I never stopped loving you." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Love? You call this love?" His voice was filled with anger now, the raw pain spilling over. "You think it's love to lie to someone, to cheat on them, to build a life together while sneaking around with someone else?" His words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. I felt the weight of his accusations, the truth in them, and it was almost too much to bear. But I forced myself to listen, to take it all in, knowing I deserved every word. "I don't know what to say," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I made a mistake. I know that. And if I could take it back, I would." He looked at me, his gaze filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "That's just it, though. You can't take it back. You can't undo this. And now I'm left trying to figure out if I can live with what you've done, if I can ever look at you and not see the betrayal." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid. I could feel the distance between us, the chasm that had opened up, and I knew it was one I might never be able to bridge. Finally, he took a deep breath, his gaze softening slightly. "I don't know if I can forgive you, or if I even want to try, but I do know that I can't make that decision here in this house with all these memories." I nodded, feeling the tears spill over as I realized what he was saying. He wasn't ready to leave, but he wasn't ready to stay, either. He was caught, just as I was, trapped between the life we'd shared and the pain I'd caused. "So, what does that mean?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked away, his expression pained. It means I need more time, more space. I don't know what the future holds, but I can't stay here, not right now. I felt a pang of fear, the realization sinking, in that he was slipping away, that this might be the last time I'd see him for a long time. But I knew I couldn't force him to stay, couldn't beg for forgiveness when he wasn't ready to give it. I understand, I replied, my voice choked with emotion. Take all the time you need. I just want you to know that I'll be here waiting, no matter how long it takes. He nodded, his gaze softening for a brief moment, a flicker of the love we'd once shared shining through the hurt. I don't know if that's fair to either of us, but thank you. He turned and walked toward the door, and I watched as he stepped outside, the sound of his car starting up filling the empty silence. I stood there, alone in the doorway, the house feeling emptier than ever, a hollow shell filled with memories of a life that felt like a distant dream. As his car disappeared down the street, I felt the finality of it settling over me, the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down on my chest. I'd made my choice, and now I had to live with it, no matter how painful, no matter how empty it left me. The silence of the house was deafening, a constant reminder of the life I'd thrown away, and as I sank to the floor, the tears came, a flood of regret and sorrow washing over me as I faced the truth. I'd broken something I could never repair, and I was left with nothing but the hollow echoes of a love that had slipped through my fingers. The days that followed Michael's departure bled into each other, a blur of emptiness and regret. I moved through the house like a ghost, surrounded by memories that felt both comforting and painful, each one a reminder of the life I'd lost. I hadn't heard from him since that day, hadn't received so much as a message or a sign that he was willing to give us another chance. The silence was deafening, a weight that pressed down on me, filling every corner of my life with a constant ache. I found myself replaying our last conversation over and over, hearing his words echo in my mind. You destroyed everything. Each time I remembered his face, the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal in his voice, I felt a fresh wave of guilt crash over me. There was no escaping it, no way to distract myself from the reality of what I'd done. Eventually, I realized that I couldn't stay locked up in the house forever. The walls, once comforting and familiar, had become a prison, a constant reminder of my mistakes. I needed a way out, something to help me move forward, even if I wasn't sure what forward looked like anymore. So one morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in a long time. I took a drive. As I drove through the city, past familiar landmarks and places Michael and I had once shared, I felt a sense of clarity begin to settle over me. The hurt and regret were still there, raw and ever present, but with each passing mile, I found myself looking back on everything that had led me here. My marriage, my mistakes, my choices with Ethan, all of it came into focus in a way I hadn't allowed myself to see before. I pulled into a quiet park and sat on a bench overlooking a lake, the gentle ripples on the water mirroring the turmoil inside me. For the first time, I allowed myself to confront the truth, to peel back the layers of justification and excuses I'd built up around my actions. I had been lonely, yes, and Michael had been distant, but those were circumstances, not reasons. I'd made the choice to betray him, to seek comfort and connection in someone else, and that choice had led me here. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much I'd relied on others, on Michael, on Ethan, even on friends and family to define my sense of worth. I'd lost myself somewhere along the way, buried under the roles I thought I had to fill, the expectations I thought I had to meet. But now, with everything stripped away, I was left with nothing but the painful truth that I was the architect of my own heartbreak. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the water, I felt a small sense of peace begin to settle over me. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from forgiveness or closure, but rather the kind that comes from facing the truth, however painful it might be. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices I'd made, but I could decide what to do with the future, however uncertain it might be. That night, I returned home with a sense of purpose, a clarity that I hadn't felt in weeks. I knew that I needed to make things right, not just with Michael, but with myself. I needed to rebuild my life from the ground up, to find a sense of identity that wasn't wrapped up in someone else's approval or affection. The next morning, I reached out to a therapist, someone I'd heard about through a friend. It was a step I'd avoided for too long, a reminder that I couldn't fix everything on my own, but it was a step I knew I needed to take. If I was ever going to find a way forward, I had to confront the deeper issues that had led me here, the patterns of self-doubt and insecurity that had driven my choices. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the work of self-reflection and healing. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could confront my mistakes without judgment, where I could unpack the layers of guilt and shame that had become a part of my daily life. Each session was difficult, forcing me to confront parts of myself I'd long ignored, but with each passing week, I began to feel a little lighter, a little more at peace with the person I was becoming. I also began to reconnect with old friends, people I'd drifted away from over the years. Slowly, I started to rebuild a life outside of my marriage, outside of the roles I'd once felt defined me. It was a fragile process, filled with moments of doubt and pain, but it was a process that felt necessary, a way of reclaiming the parts of myself I'd lost along the way. And then, one evening, as I was tidying up the living room, my phone buzzed with a message. My heart raced as I picked it up, hoping against hope that it was from Michael, that maybe he was ready to talk, to try again. But it wasn't from Michael, it was from Ethan. "Hey, I've been thinking about you. Can we meet up?" I stared at the message, a rush of conflicting emotions flooding over me. Part of me wanted to respond, to reach out and find comfort in the familiar connection we'd shared. But as I stood there, the phone in my hand, I realized that this was another choice, a moment where I had to decide which path I wanted to take. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes as I thought about everything I'd learned, everything I'd worked through in the weeks since Michael had left. I thought about the woman I wanted to become, the life I wanted to build, and the mistakes I knew I couldn't afford to repeat. With a sense of finality, I typed out a response. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I can't see you anymore. I need to find my own way." I hit send, feeling a sense of closure settle over me as I watched the message disappear. It was a small step, a quiet choice, but it was a choice that felt right, a choice that aligned with the person I was trying to become. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of hope, a flicker of possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild, that I could find a way forward, even if it meant doing so alone. I didn't know what the future held or if Michael would ever forgive me, but I knew one thing for certain. I was ready to face whatever came next, with a newfound strength that was entirely my own. The days after I sent that final message to Ethan were filled with a strange mix of emptiness and relief. There was a finality to it, a sense that a chapter of my life had truly closed. I'd chosen to leave behind the tangled web of secrets and betrayals that had nearly consumed me, and though it left me feeling exposed and vulnerable, it also offered a quiet peace. Without the distraction of Ethan, I found myself confronting the full weight of my past choices. There was no more hiding, no more escape. It was just me, alone with the person I'd become. And while I was learning to live with the consequences, there were still moments when the regret felt unbearable, an ache that settled deep within my chest. One evening, as I was cleaning out a drawer in the bedroom, I came across an old photo of Michael and me, taken on our wedding day. We were both smiling, our arms wrapped around each other, eyes bright with the promise of a future we could barely imagine. Looking at that photo, I felt a surge of grief for the life we'd dreamed of, the life that had slipped through my fingers. I missed him, his laugh, his touch, the way he could make me feel like I was the only person in the world. I missed the version of us that existed before everything went wrong. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, memories flooding over me like a tidal wave. I could remember the day we moved into this house, the way we'd stayed up late, unpacking boxes and talking about our plans for the future. We'd been so full of hope, so certain that nothing could come between us. But now, as I lay there alone, I could feel the distance between that version of myself and the person I was now, a distance filled with choices I couldn't undo. I knew I needed closure, something to help me move forward, even if it meant acknowledging that the life I'd once dreamed of was over. So the next morning, I sat down with a pen and paper and began to write a letter to Michael. I poured everything into that letter: the regret, the apology, the love I still felt for him. I wanted him to know that I understood the pain I'd caused, that I didn't expect forgiveness, but needed him to know how deeply I regretted my actions. Writing the letter was both painful and cathartic. With each word, I felt a small part of the guilt ease, replaced by a quiet acceptance of the reality I'd created. I knew he might never read it, that he might not even want to hear from me, but it was something I had to do, a way of making peace with the past. When I finished, I folded the letter carefully, placing it in an envelope. I wasn't sure if I would actually send it, but the act of putting my feelings into words felt like a step forward, a way of letting go of the guilt that had been weighing me down. Over the next few weeks, I continued to focus on rebuilding my life, piece by piece. I reconnected with friends, filled my days with activities that brought me a sense of purpose, and continued my therapy sessions, each one a small step toward healing. I was learning to be alone, to find strength within myself rather than in the approval or affection of someone else. And then, one morning, as I was sipping my coffee and watching the sunrise, my phone buzzed with a message notification. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up, the familiar name on the screen making my hands tremble. It was Michael. "Can we meet? There are things I want to talk about." I stared at the message, my mind racing with a mixture of hope and fear. I didn't know what he wanted to say, didn't know if he was ready to forgive, or if he simply needed closure, but I knew I couldn't ignore the message. This was the chance I'd been hoping for, the opportunity to face him, to look him in the eyes and finally speak the truth, without hiding behind excuses or defenses. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the screen as I typed out a response. "Yes, just tell me when and where." The day passed in a blur, each hour filled with a nervous anticipation that made it hard to focus. I didn't know what to expect, didn't know if he'd come with forgiveness in his heart, or if he'd simply come to say goodbye. All I knew was that this conversation was necessary, a step I couldn't avoid if I ever wanted to find peace. When the evening came, I found myself at the small cafe where we'd agreed to meet, sitting at a table near the window. The air was filled with the aroma of coffee and the soft hum of conversation, but I could barely focus, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts as I waited for him to arrive. Then finally I saw him. He walked in, looking both familiar and different, as if the weeks apart had changed him in ways I couldn't see. He spotted me and made his way over, his expression unreadable as he took a seat across from me. For a moment we sat in silence, the weight of everything unsaid filling the space between us. I could feel my heart pounding, the words I'd practiced in my head suddenly feeling inadequate in the face of the man I'd betrayed. "Thank you for meeting me," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze steady. "I wasn't sure if I wanted to, but I felt like I needed to hear from you, to understand why." I took a deep breath, gathering my thoughts. "Michael, I don't know if I can give you a reason that will make sense. The truth is, I was selfish. I let my own insecurities and loneliness drive me to make choices I can't take back. I know I hurt you, and I know I betrayed your trust, and I am so sorry." He looked down, his hands folded on the table. For a long time he didn't speak, and I felt a wave of uncertainty wash over me, afraid that my words weren't enough. Finally, he lifted his gaze, his expression softening slightly. "I've been angry for so long. I felt like everything we built, everything we dreamed of was just gone, and I wanted to hate you for it. But I realized that holding on to that anger was only hurting me." I nodded, my heart aching as I listened. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'll always regret what I did. You deserved so much better." He let out a sigh, his gaze drifting to the window. "Maybe. But I think we both lost sight of each other somewhere along the way. And maybe, in a way, we both contributed to what happened." I could see the sadness in his eyes, the acceptance that this wasn't just one person's mistake, but the result of a relationship that had slowly unraveled. It didn't erase the pain, didn't justify my choices, but it offered a small measure of understanding, a reminder that our story was more complicated than one betrayal. As we continued to talk, the hurt and anger between us began to soften, replaced by a tentative peace. There was no clear answer, no promise of reconciliation, but there was a sense of closure, a feeling that we'd both taken the first steps toward healing. When we parted ways that night, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a quiet sense of release. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if we'd find our way back to each other, or if we'd go our separate ways. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could both find a way forward. In the weeks after that meeting with Michael, life settled into a tented calm, a fragile peace that felt both comforting and bittersweet. The conversation we'd shared, the raw honesty and quiet acceptance that lingered between us, had given me something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time: hope. It wasn't a hope for a future together, not exactly, but rather a hope for healing, a sense that we could both move forward without the shadows of our past weighing us down. Michael and I kept our distance, each of us needing space to process, to continue the work of rebuilding our lives in our own way. I missed him, missed the life we'd shared. But I knew that clinging to the past wouldn't bring either of us the peace we needed. Our paths had diverged, and while I still held a deep love for him, I had finally come to terms with the fact that we might never find our way back to what we once had. In the meantime, I focused on myself, on reclaiming the parts of me I'd neglected for too long. Therapy became my anchor, a place where I could confront my fears, my insecurities, the patterns of self-sabotage that had led me down this path. Each session was a step toward understanding, toward facing the truth of who I was and who I wanted to become. I began filling my days with things that brought me joy: reading, painting, long walks in the park, simple activities that reminded me of the person I'd once been, the person I was rediscovering. I reconnected with friends, sharing laughter and stories, finding a sense of community that I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It was slow work, sometimes painful, but it was work that felt deeply necessary. One morning, as I was sipping my coffee on the back porch, watching the sun rise over the trees, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole, content with my own company, content with the person I was becoming. It was in that quiet moment that I realized I didn't need anyone else to complete me, to define my worth. I had spent so much of my life searching for validation in others, in relationships, in roles I thought I was meant to fill. But here, in the stillness of the morning, I understood that my worth was intrinsic, something that had been there all along, waiting for me to recognize it. Over time, I noticed a shift in how I carried myself, in the way I interacted with the world. I no longer felt the need to apologize for who I was, no longer felt the need to chase after love or approval. I was learning to be patient with myself, to forgive myself for the mistakes I'd made, and to approach life with a renewed sense of purpose. And then, one afternoon, as I was returning from a walk, I saw a familiar figure waiting at my doorstep. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized Michael, standing there with his hands in his pockets, his expression uncertain yet hopeful. I approached slowly, feeling a mix of emotions: surprise, nervousness, and a cautious optimism that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. He looked up as I neared, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Hey," he greeted softly, his voice warm. "Hey," I replied, smiling as I unlocked the door, motioning for him to come inside. We sat in the living room, the quiet familiarity of the space settling around us. For a while, we didn't speak, each of us taking in the moment, the weight of everything that had happened lingering in the air. Finally, Michael cleared his throat, his gaze meeting mine. "I wanted to see how you were doing. It's been a while." I nodded, feeling a warmth spread through me at his concern. "I've been okay, better actually. I've been working on myself, trying to make peace with everything." He nodded, a hint of admiration in his expression. I can see that. You seem different. Lighter, maybe. A smile crossed my lips, and I nodded. I feel different. I've been doing a lot of reflecting, a lot of growing. It hasn't been easy, but it's been good. He smiled, a genuine warmth in his gaze. I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to find that peace, to be happy. We sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the past no longer as heavy between us. It was a moment of quiet understanding, a shared recognition of the journey we'd both been on, the growth we'd experienced in our time apart. I wanted to tell you something, he said finally, his tone gentle. I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness, about what it means, and I realized that holding on to anger wasn't helping me. I don't know if we'll ever be the same, but I don't want to carry that bitterness anymore. His words hit me deeply, a wave of gratitude washing over me as I nodded, my eyes misting with tears. Thank you, Michael. That means more than you know. We didn't make any promises that day, didn't speak of reconciliation or the possibility of a future together. But there was a sense of closure, a sense of mutual respect and understanding that felt like a step toward healing, toward letting go of the pain and finding peace. As he left that day, I felt a lightness in my chest, a sense of freedom that had been missing for so long. I knew that our paths might cross again, that maybe one day we'd find our way back to each other. But I also knew that, for now, I was content, grounded in the person I'd become, confident in the life I was building. In the quiet days that followed, I continued to move forward, each step a reminder of the strength I'd discovered within myself. I was no longer defined by my past, no longer held back by the weight of my mistakes. I was free, at peace, and ready to face whatever came next. For the first time, I felt whole, complete in a way that I hadn't known was possible. And as I looked to the future, I knew that no matter what happened, I was strong enough to face it, to embrace the life I was creating on my own terms, with a heart that had finally found its way home.